All of the dystopias and utopias we read about have had one pretty common idea at their heart: getting rid of suffering. It makes sense that tons of authors would want to write short stories and novels about societies that have figured out ways to solve this problem, considering how universal the idea of suffering is. Everyone nowadays would love to never ever need to experience pain or any form of trauma, so we all think about how to avoid it, some admittedly in very different ways than others. But one important thing that can be said regarding this topic in the stories we've read is as follows. Attempts to solve suffering on a societal level introduce new suffering by having to control mass individual free will. Personal attempts to cope with and rid of suffering, on the other hand, are far more successful due to their individualistic nature. The first idea in our thesis is when societies try to control mass individual free will, meaning they try to solve suffering on a societal level, it ends up leading to more, often new forms of suffering. This can very clearly be seen in Repent Harley Quinn. In order to try to make a perfectly functioning society, the TikTok man dictates the actions and timing of what everyone else does down to the minute. And this rigid control structure leads to the point where even the smallest disturbance to society introduces massive problems. So here's a short quote from the book. The shift was delayed 7 minutes. They did not get home for 7 minutes. The master schedule was thrown off by 7 minutes. The system had been 7 minutes worth of disrupted. It was a tiny matter, one hardly worthy of note, but in a society where the single driving force was order and unity and promptness, and clock-like precision and attention to the clock, reverence of the gods of the passage of time, it was a disaster of major importance. So clearly, a 7 minute delay in pretty much anything in a normal society wouldn't be much of a problem. But for the case of Repent Harley Quinn, it's a big disaster that's been caused just because this whole society has been forced to conform to a strict schedule dictated by the TikTok man. So the TikTok man has clearly tried to control everybody's free will, meaning they're not able to decide at what time they're going to do stuff, including their jobs. And the whole point of this is to try to eliminate suffering and make an efficient and equitable society. In the case of Repent Harley Quinn, though, this creates a big situation where the smallest disturbance to time, as the quote says, just 7 minutes, introduces giant disturbances and leads to a new form, but clearly an impactful form of suffering.
Another example of trying to solve suffering on a societal level is in the lottery. So in this town, they have a lottery in which every single town member participates, and for the first half of the story, we're never told why this happens and what the lottery actually is until we reach this quote. Lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chickweed and acorns. There's always been a lottery. So essentially, what we're told is that the town is holding a lottery so that they can have a good harvest, which makes sense because, once again, this is just a way to try to get rid of suffering. So, for the first half of the story, we have no clue about the barbaric nature of the lottery until we hear that it's literally one person of the town being chosen to get stoned to death. And we see this when Tessie Hutchison gets chosen. Tessie was in the center of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair," she said. A stone hit her on the side of the head. "It isn't fair, it isn't right," Miss Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her. So, even though the point of the lottery is to solve suffering in by the means of getting a good harvest, it introduces a very clear and very violent form of new suffering. One random member that's done nothing wrong is chosen from the society and is literally stoned to death. So clearly, this method of trying to get rid of suffering is not effective because it's just introducing a new form of suffering. So this is very similar to Repent Harley Quinn and the next book that we're going to talk about, in that it attempts to solve suffering on a large scale and tries to and almost successfully gets rid of it, but it really just introduces other forms of suffering because of how it's unable to address it and would just be better off on an individual level.
The second book we're going to be covering is The Lottery, where we have a town that hosts an annual lottery in which a person is publicly stoned to death. We get introduced to this in one of the first lines that goes, "The lottery's in June, the corn will be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chickweed and acorns. There's always been a lottery." This tells us two main things. The first was that the lottery was made with a purpose in mind, which was to guarantee good harvests and promote the general welfare. And the second is that it's rooted in the town's tradition, through the sentence, "There's always been a lottery." We get a further glimpse as to how the residents of the society actually view the lottery through the quote, although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remember to use stones. This draws an important distinction. They recognize how to actually conduct the ritual of the lottery with the violence and the cruelty behind it, but they have no consideration or even knowledge of the damage it causes and the moral implications of it. This draws another distinction between the societal purpose of the institution itself and the motivations of the individuals within that society who just blindly conform to these institutions and allow suffering to be perpetuated through that institution. We actually get a glimpse of this suffering later in the story when an individual is directly impacted by it. This is the character Tessie. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair," she said. A stone hit her on the side of the head. "It isn't fair. It isn't right," Mrs. Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her. This is arguably the most important point in the entire story because we finally see an individual questioning and considering the suffering that their society causes. Tessie is complicit, just like everyone else, in the suffering and violence that her society causes until she's put in a position where she's directly impacted by it, where she realizes the suffering on an individual level that her society faces in an attempt to guarantee and promote general welfare through a good harvest. This draws another important distinction between society and an individual and shows us that any attempt to solve suffering on a massive scale without considering the actual individual burdens that those solutions cause, which is exactly what the lottery is, will inevitably just create more suffering. We see this theme explored in more detail in Omelas, which is described to us as this perfect utopia where everyone is happy, where there's no kings, no slaves, and no strict rules whatsoever. And then halfway through the story, we see a turning point in this description. They all know it is there, all the people of Omelas. They all understand that their happiness, the beauty of their city, the tenderness of their friendships, the health of their children, the wisdom of their scholars, the skill of their makers, even the abundance of their harvest, and the kindly weathers of their skies depend wholly on this child's abominable misery. This is an important turning point in the narration of the story, from a glamorized portrayal of Omelas as this perfect society, which we also see at the beginning of this quote, with an enumeration of all of the things that make the place so wonderful, to a point that completely diverges from that, to a focus on the suffering within that society that guarantees all of these wonderful things about the place. We can see that Omelas is a clear example of a society that tried to solve suffering by controlling free will on a massive scale, by allowing for the suffering of one individual to guarantee all of these generic qualities that apply to everyone else. And we can see that in this attempt to solve suffering on a massive scale, the society has just created more suffering, which you can see through a child being tortured in a basement continuously just for the general welfare of the rest of the population. Everyone in the society that chooses to stay is forced to be complicit in that suffering. However, there's an important distinction between Omelas and the other two stories we've covered. Unlike Repent Harlequin and The Lottery, there's a component of choice in Omelas. The residents of the society get to choose whether they want to be a part of it, whether they want to be complicit in this suffering, or if they want to leave, if they can realize the moral implications of it and are not willing to participate in them. This is a point we're going to explore in our second claim about successful attempts of getting rid of suffering on a personal, individual level.
So far, we've examined how attempts at coping with suffering on a mass scale fail, but in these works we can also see where they succeed on an individual scale. At the conclusion of Candide, we finally see the perfect optimistic philosophy of Pangloss rebuffed by Candide when he exclaims, "We must all cultivate our own garden," in response to Pangloss's attempt to rationalize the principal character's success at finding their garden at the end of the story as part of what must have happened. Candide is able to break out from Pangloss's all-encompassing optimistic philosophy, a philosophy that ultimately led to a more rudderless existence, by no longer considering the world as something that must fit into his worldview, but himself as something that must fit into the world. A less philosophical but more concrete example of this comes from Omelas, although that might seem a bit counterintuitive as the child remains imprisoned at the end of the story. In Omelas, the citizens make the choice to either stay or leave, the choice to either stomach the horror they've seen as a necessity, or to see it as too much for their conscience and to leave. The citizens who know that the child staying in prison is too much, who know they can't take part in a society who does that, are the ones who leave, and by othering themselves from Omelas, by individualizing themselves, they escape the suffering being part of a city built on the torture of a child brings. They are, in their own way, escaping suffering by removing themselves from the collective of Omelas and wiping their hands as their own. A final example of this success in escaping suffering as an individual comes from Repent Harlequin, where although the Harlequin is executed in the end, he is the only one to ever truly escape the suffering of his society. He removes the name Everett C. Marm, the name he knows the TikTok man can kill with his cardio plate, and adopts the identity of the Harlequin, an identity outside of his control and outside of the mass system the TikTok man represents. And by displacing himself from this system, he is the only one able to effect any sort of change. While, for example, the factory workers can stop and laugh at his jelly beans, they don't have the freedom to go do that for themselves. They are still cogs in the TikTok man's machine. As we've seen so far, suffering is only able to be solved on an individual level as suffering comes from different individual causes. Any attempt to categorize these all under one umbrella that can be solved by one true cause is just going to end up being another imposition of suffering from another individual source. In all of our novels, we've been able to see both how these mass attempts at solving suffering lead to more, and how only on an individual level can suffering truly be escaped.